organizers for putting this together and inviting me. And I'm just really sad that I'm not actually there. There were some medical issues and I wasn't able to fly. So I love Cambridge and this is an awesome conference. So, and I'm sorry that I have to give you this talk by Zoom instead of in person, but I'll do the best I can with that. And what I'm going to talk about is a collaboration involving Sept Fraden and Zvonimir Dojic doing experiments, machine learning expertise from Peng-Yu Hong in Brandeis computer science, and then strong theoretical collaboration with Aparna Bhaskaran. And most of the work, let me see if I can get this to a laser pointer. Most of the work I'll describe was done by two excellent graduate students, Chaitanya Joshi and Saptarshi Ghosh. And so for many years, my group and I have been using theory and computation to try to understand self-assembly and self-organization. How does a system of relatively simple units use the laws of physics to evolve into some complex, functional, intricate pattern? And then more recently, we've started to integrate also some tools from data-driven science and machine learning. And I want to tell you about some preliminary progress we've made along those lines. And in particular, for this talk, I want to focus on what we've been doing with active matter. I think all of you are, by this point, familiar with active matter, but it describes a material whose constituent components can consume energy to drive forces or motion. And when those components interact with each other, it leads to an upward in length scale cascade of active stresses that then manifest at macroscopic scales as spectacular collective behaviors. And indeed, that's what underlies many of the functions that make living organisms possible, such as the examples that I'm showing here. Now, more recently, over the past 10 or 15 years, researchers have developed biomimetic or synthetic analogs of these active units that they can reconstitute in the lab and put together. And the idea is, and what we tell our program officers for our grants is that with those materials in hand, we can now make human engineered materials that are going to transform material science because they're going to have capabilities like what you see here. But there is a problem, which is that that's typically not what you get. The vast majority of active systems are intrinsically unstable to chaotic, undirected motions, such as you see here. So here I'm showing the very well-studied system of kinesins and microtubules that was developed by Zvonimir Dojic. This is the case where it forms a 2D active pneumatic because it's on an oil-water interface. And you see that it's unstable to the formation of these topological defects that lead to this turbulent-like behavior. So you can't get functions or productive work out of a material like this. The way that biology gets around this is through regulation so that it can tightly choreograph in space and time these active forces. And here I'm just showing the well-known example of motility of a cell, where you have extension at the front of the cell and then contractile forces at the back that allow it to move and, for example, then engulf some pathogen. So if we want similar functionalities in human engineered materials, we need a similar capability to be able to exert control on the system. And recently that has become possible technically, experimentally. For example, in the context of active pneumatics, there are now optogenetic motors that become active only when light is shown on them. And so in the example here, in the yellow box, light is being shown and the system is active. It's dark outside of that box and the system is inactive. And importantly, the magnitude of activity is proportional to the intensity of the light. And this can be done as a spatiotemporal light pattern using a digital light projector. So basically, you can program a sequence of now activity in space and time. And the job then for us theorists is to tell them, well, what should that spatiotemporal field be if I want the system to go to some certain functional state? This is, of course, a very hard problem. It's an inverse problem, but it's made doubly hard because solving it requires a quantitatively accurate model. And for the vast majority of these active systems are in general very complicated, but also because they're far from equilibrium. And so you don't have analogs of free energy or separation of timescales, et cetera. So what we wanted to know was, could data-driven and machine learning techniques help with this? Could we build models that would allow us to be able to control the system? And at the same time, could we actually learn some physics while doing it? And we adopted two complementary approaches in parallel to try this. The first I'll call the physics-based approach. So we used a data discovery model tool, actually Cindy, which was already brought up by the previous speakers, to try to obtain an accurate physics model for a system. We then combine that with optimal control theory to drive it into the desired behavior. The second approach is, at least in the beginning, we throw the physics out altogether and we ask if modern machine learning tools can be used on their own to predict and control the dynamics of a system, for example, using reinforcement learning. I'm going to start by describing the physics-based approach, and then I'll tell you how far we've gotten with the machine learning approach. And then what we're working on now is ways to combine these two approaches together. So for the physics-based approach, again, the first step is we want to derive, in our case, a continuum hydrodynamic theory for the active material. Everything I'm going to tell you about today is going to be focused on a 2D active pneumatic, but we are also applying these same methods to different 3D systems, which if I have time, I'll show you an example of at the end. So the idea here is I want a continuum hydrodynamic theory. So a theory that's written in terms of the relevant fields. That would be the pneumatic tensor, which includes the director field orientation and the magnitude of order S, and then also the fluid velocity U. And the usual approach here is you perform a low order symmetry expansion. You take combinations of these fields and their gradients, you expand them out, you keep the terms that are allowed by symmetry, and then you truncate it at as low an order as you possibly can to make it tractable. And many of you have done this, many others have done this, and you generally arrive for this system at a system of equations that looks like this. You have an equation for elastic dissipation of the director field. You have an equation for fluid flow, which may or may not include inertial terms. Then you have an equation for coupling between flow and the director field orientation. Then you add a term to describe the active stress that is coming from these kinesins pushing the microtubules around, and to lowest order, that's proportional to the order parameter Q, the pneumatic tensor Q, and there's an important proportionality coefficient alpha, which describes the level of activity. So this is the program, but the problem is that it doesn't actually work to stop at lowest order. So you have to add in your favorite higher order terms, and that has led to many different versions of these equations being in the literature. We don't know which one is right because, to my knowledge, until our work, none of them had been quantitatively compared against experiments, and we didn't have quantitative estimates for the coefficients. So we turned to the tool, which again has already been described, Cindy. And again, there are many ways to approach this. We liked Cindy because it directly gives you a very interpretable physics model. It was actually developed by Brunton and coworkers in the field of fluid turbulence. We and a few other groups have applied it now to active matter. It's already been described to some extent. I'll give a little bit more of a description. The idea is very simple in concept. You start with a large data set. So in our case, we had active pneumatics dynamics at different ATP concentrations from Zwanimir's lab. The idea is you assume a very general library of terms, basically all those combinations of the fields and their gradients up to hopefully some sufficiently high order that you pick. But then you're going to use the data to perform sparse regression to find the so-called optimal model, which we define as the most parsimonious model, meaning the model with the fewest number of terms required to accurately fit the data. And it's really important that you're, in our opinion, that you're finding the minimal model, because that's how you learn physics from this. You distinguish the terms that contribute to the physics from the many other terms that have negligible contribution to the physics of your system. Then it's, of course, essential that you test against data. But really, the absolutely most important part of this whole process is that experimental data, it's full of noise and errors. It's very hard to deal with for a tool like this, which is trying to learn a continuum equation. And so it's essential that you build data processing algorithms that can address that error. And Chaitanya and my postdoc Chris put a tremendous amount of effort into finding out what the right processing algorithms were for active matter data. Given the time, I'm not going to go into all the details on what they did, although I can address it in questions. And here I just want to show an example of how one does this. We eventually applied it to the experimental data, but first you want to test this on a system where you have a known ground truth. And so what we did is we took a simulation of essentially the equations I showed you on the previous slide. We added some noise to that, and then we performed Cindy on it to see if we get the right equations back. Here I'm just showing the alignment equation. There's also an equation for the fluid that I'm not showing here. And we used the sequentially thresholded sparse regression to do this. And basically what this means is one by one, you drop terms from this giant library. I'm not showing all the terms here. You keep dropping them, every time dropping the one that raises the error between your model prediction and the dynamics, the actual experimental or simulation data. So you drop the term that contributes the least to the error. And you keep doing this until you arrive at a point where suddenly you drop a term and you get a significant contribution to the error. That tells you that at this point, you're left with only the terms that significantly contribute to the physics of the system. And so those are the terms that constitute your optimal model. And indeed, when you do this for our simulation, it returns the equations that we put in. And just as importantly, it returns quantitatively accurate estimates of the coefficients that we put into the model as well. So it gives you the optimal model and the coefficients at the same time. Okay, so this is just doing it on simulations. Here's an example of doing it on experiments. So each of these curves here is showing us performing this sparse regression, but each of these curves is data at a different ATP concentration, so presumably a different activity level. You see that's not quite as clean as in the case of the simulations. Where that jump is exactly can be a little bit harder to distinguish, but from all these curves together, we arrived at a consensus model for the 2D active pneumatics. And what was surprising about that model was how minimal it is. It basically tells us that here I'm again showing at this point just the alignment equation. It shows us that the physics is completely dominated by coupling between flow and the alignment of director field. It's the terms that we get for evolution of the director field are just convection, rotation, and flow alignment. And in particular, we don't have the free energy terms that would be there in a traditional liquid crystal. And this was actually predicted some years ago by Julia Yeoman's work. But here we see now experimental confirmation of that fact. Okay, we also have to do this for the velocity. Here we arrived at an even simpler equation. We find that just two terms are required to accurately describe the velocity field. There's the viscous dissipation and there's the lowest order active stress. And so this is an example of how you can learn physics by doing this, because it showed us that a lot of other terms that are often included in velocity equations for active pneumatics, at least for the conditions that Zvonimir was studying, are not contributing important physics. So the inertial term is not important. Similarly, we don't need to include a substrate friction term, which is included in many models of active pneumatics. The other important thing is that this coefficient of the active stress term, again, is directly proportional to the activity strength. This is a parameter that until now we had never been able to quantitatively measure, but we know the viscosity of the system and we get a quantitative value for A3. So we now actually have, for the first time, a measurement of the activity as a function of ATP concentration. And that's what I'm showing here. The green circles are the measurement from Cindy of the activity coefficient, and you see how it increases with ATP concentration. The other thing that's important is, again, one has to independently test this so-called optimal model against the experiments. We did many, many such tests. In the interest of time, I'm only going to show you one. That test that I'm going to show you is theory tells you that the activity coefficient should be equal to the inverse of the velocity-velocity autocorrelation time scale. We could make independent measurements of that directly from the experimental data. That's shown as the blue triangles, and you see that they quantitatively match the calculation from Cindy. Again, we did many other tests, which I won't show you. This is the optimal model that we arrived at. I don't want to go into details on the other tests because I want to go on to now that you have a model, what can you do with it? And again, I'm not showing you the coefficients here, but we have now estimates for all of the coefficients. So what we can do with it is now we can combine it with optimal control theory to try to actually get our system to do something useful. And the idea is we take essentially the set of equations that I just showed you, except now because there's a spatiotemporal activity field that's being controlled by light intensity, our alpha, the activity parameter, can now depend on both space and time. And the idea is, given an initial condition, what is that sequence in space and time of alpha that drives it to some particular target state? And that target state is some prescribed function of the director field and or the velocity field. And so this is a boundary value problem. There's a number of ways to solve it. We used a well-known reliable way to do so called direct adjoint looping method, which we implemented in the open source Phoenix solver and have made publicly available. I'm not going to go into details on this method. I can say a little bit more about the optimal control framework itself. I think many of you are probably familiar with this, but if not, the idea is that you're going to write down an objective function that you want to optimize. It's going to include terms that penalize deviations away from your target state. So here the delta U and the delta Q are deviations of the fluid velocity or the director field from the target state. Then you also include regularization terms, for example, penalizing large values of the activity or very high gradients in the activity, because experimentally that would be hard to impose. You add a Lagrangian that forces the system to obey the actual dynamics, and then you minimize that whole thing using a gradient descent method. Okay, and so that's the idea. Here I'm showing you the results of doing it, and we tried this for a number of different target states, or if you will, control goals. The first one I'm showing you is an example where we take a bulk chaotic system, and then we pick a region of interest, this lighted square in the center of the box, and we say that we want the active pneumatic to be uniformly aligned along a prescribed direction, in this case 45 degrees, within that square domain. And then we ask the system to give us the activity field that will cause that to happen. And so on the right, I'm showing as a function of time the director field, and the colors give the pneumatic order, and the bright circles show where there are topological defects. And you see that indeed over time the system evolves into alignment within the square box. The left is showing the activity pattern that the system found it needed to impose in order to achieve that. And you see that it's rather complicated, because at initial times it needs activity that's going to drive all the defects out of the square region and at the same time align it in the direction we want. And then at later times, we need activity near the boundaries in order to keep any further defects from getting into this region. So there's just a couple of important things to say about this solution. First, this is a behavior that you could never achieve in the absence of control, because this is definitely not an attractor of the natural system dynamics. This shows you that you can get non-attractor states through control. The other is, as a comparison to many other optimal control problems that I've seen, this is a very complicated high-dimensional solution space, because here we're specifying alpha at many points in space and time and solving for all of them simultaneously. And by the way, I don't know if I made this clear. What I'm showing you here is being done on a PDE simulation. The idea is that we're then going to translate this framework over to experiments. Everything I'm going to show you for the rest of the talk was done on PDE simulations, but we are actually working right now with Seth Frieden's group to implement these things in the experiments. Okay, so this was one control goal. I'll just quickly show you. We did this. We were able to do this for a number of different target states. This is an example where we again take a bulk system, but we want it to behave as if there's a channel running through the middle, specifically where these green dashed lines are. We want there to be coherent flow in the x direction running through that stripe. And so again, we run our framework. and it indeed is able to come up with a solution where it comes up with an activity profile that causes a bend deformation, which indeed leads to a coherent flow through the channel. And interestingly, we were then able to try different system sizes, and it would come up with similar but different bend profiles that still achieved the coherent flow through the x direction. So this is good. I'm not going to show you. We did this on a polar fluid as well. We did this for other types of targets. We were able pretty reliably to obtain the solutions that we wanted. But we envisioned while we were doing this that there may be some difficulty in actually implementing this in experiments, because again, experiments are subject to noise and error. And so, you know, there are ways to make optimal control robust to noise and error, but we're a little bit concerned about were they going to be enough to deal with the level of error in these experimental systems. So in parallel, we were also pursuing a different approach, which we think may be even more robust against noise and error, and that's to use reinforcement learning. Again, many of you are probably familiar with reinforcement learning, but the idea is that you have some environment which eventually, and as I said, we are actually implementing this now, will be the experimental system. But for what I'm going to show you, it's a simulation model. That environment gives you observations of the state of the system. So in our case, it's going to give the director field and the velocity field. We actually had to develop our own machine learning tools to be able to reliably extract these from experimental data. These are then fed to an agent, and the job of the agent is through trial and error to learn how to propose, given an observation, to propose an action that's going to drive the system toward the behavior that you want. And it gets a reward function that is a positive reward when it's driving the system closer to the behavior that you want. In our case, the action that's going to be proposed is a short spatiotemporal sequence of activity. And so the important thing here is that, at least in principle, you don't need to know anything at all about the physics of the system in order to do this. Although, of course, what we're looking into now is, can you make this work better if you use the fact that you do, in fact, know something about the physics? But as a starting point, we wanted to see what you could get with no physics at all. I'm not going to go into details on the architecture we used. We used what at the time we started was a cutting edge actor critic with a PPO algorithm. We're now working on, this is a very fast evolving field, and so we're now working on implementing even better ways to do this. What I'm showing here is, I'm going to show two examples of applying this technique to the same two control goals that I showed for the optimal control theory. So the first one I'm showing here is, again, trying to achieve coherent flow in the x direction through this fictitious channel set by these green lines. And I want to again emphasize that in comparison to other reinforcement learning applications that I've seen, this is an extremely challenging problem because we have such a high dimensional action space. You have to specify the activity in space over some range of time, and the spatial resolution has to be such that it's small in comparison to typical spacing between defects. So this is just a very high dimensional space that our agent has to learn, but it was able to do so at least much of the time. I'm showing an example here where, starting from an arbitrary initial condition, we arrived at coherent flow. And I'm showing another example here from a different initial condition. And this actually highlights one of the benefits of reinforcement learning in comparison to optimal control theory. In optimal control theory, if I want to start from a very different initial condition, I have to redo the whole calculation. With reinforcement learning, if you train it properly, in principle, you can give it any arbitrary initial condition and it will find a solution for you. So far, we've found that that's sort of true. We're not able to get it to converge from all initial conditions, and we're working on understanding why it fails for some. But for a wide variety of initial conditions, our model is able to converge to a solution. The second big advantage is that indeed we find this is extremely robust to noise and error. So again, this is simulation data, but we added synthetic measurement error. And so here I'm showing the mean x velocity achieved by the controller as a function of time. The blue curve is with small measurement error. The red curve is with larger measurement error. You see that in both cases, it pretty quickly reaches the velocity that we asked it to reach. And in fact, here I'm showing on the right a plot of the percent error of the solution as a function of the measurement error. The orange curve is the result for the reinforcement learning, and the blue curve is the result for the optimal control theory. And I don't want this to seem like it's a plot saying optimal control theory is terrible. There are indeed ways that you can things you can add to optimal control theory to help make it more robust against noise and error, like linear feedback or recalculation. The point I want to make here is that the reinforcement learning is remarkably robust to measurement error. Satoshi, at this point, hasn't put in a large enough error to really break it. So just right out of the box, it's quite robust against noise and error. So that gave us the confidence that we should immediately start trying to apply this to the experimental system. But at the same, this is just showing that you can do it for other control goals too. So here again is the example where we're getting the system to align in the a square region, to have it align in that square region. But of course, there are ways you should be able to make this better, and that's what we're looking into now. There are many ways in which you can combine physics knowledge with machine learning tools to hopefully make the reinforcement learning train faster and more reliably. One other approach that we think is going to be very useful is to do so-called model predictive control. So the idea there is, right now, everything I've shown you, the agent is just using total trial and error. It doesn't know anything about the future dynamics, and it learns to propose a sequence of action. But what if instead you actually have a prediction of the dynamics and you can give that prediction to the agent to help it make its proposed action? That's what model predictive control is. And you can do that either using a physics model, maybe, for example, a model that you learned from Cindy, or you can try to use machine learning to predict the dynamics and then feed that into the reinforcement learning. And so we've made some progress with the second approach using machine learning. And so some years ago with Peng Yu, we developed a forecaster using, again, deep neural nets, where you take a sequence of frames this was directly from experimental data. So these were fluorescence images from the experimental data. You would take a sequence of those images, feed them into your neural net, and then it would predict the dynamics into the future. And this actually worked pretty well. I'm showing an example on top where it's the real experimental data. And what you're seeing is the spontaneous formation of a defect pair. this is then the director field extracted from that experimental data. On the bottom is the prediction from the forecaster, the machine learning forecaster. And it can do things like predict formation of defects, annihilation of defects. So it can predict the dynamics on relevant timescales. It was somewhat limited, though. We weren't happy with how quickly the prediction would die out and error would start building up. So my postdoc Fu and now Aveg are working on ways to make this better. You heard about transformers. We're using transformers and now projecting the dynamics down onto a latent space and trying to predict the dynamics within that latent space. This has already made a significant improvement in the ability of the forecaster. So here on this plot on the right, I'm showing a measure of time. The relative error in the prediction is shown on the y-axis. The red curve is for the previous model and the blue curve is for the current model. And you see that it keeps the error down for much longer time scales than the previous model did. I think I'm essentially out of time. Let me just say that we are indeed applying this now, or hoping to apply it to more interesting 3D systems. I think I don't have time to talk about that. I'll just go to the acknowledgements. And as I said, the first part, the Cindy was performed by Chaitanya, and then the optimal control and reinforcement learning were mainly performed by Saptorshi Ghosh. And thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Questions? Questions? Fine. I'll ask a question then. You talked about minimizing your objective function using a gradient approach. Is it likely that there are many minima to your objective function, and so a stochastic search might be preferable?
Yeah, so there is some stochasticity in it. We didn't do it deterministically. You know, it's a gradient descent method that does include stochastic steps. And we also typically would do it from similar but different initial conditions to see if we arrive at a similar solution. We also tried how well does it work when you add noise, and then it is able to, well, I showed you that plot. For a certain degree of noise, it is able to arrive at solutions that, again, are very similar to what you get in the absence of noise. So there is stochasticity in there. It's a very bumpy landscape, as you guess.
Okay, any other questions, Mike?
Thanks, Mike, for an excellent talk. I had a question about the outcome of the result for the Q tensor evolution, where you find that you don't need a free energy, and that's
yes,
that is a bit puzzling.
Yes.
At first sight, it looks like the time evolution of Q with those rules is kind of out of control.
Yeah, so there's a few things I can say about that. Let me get back to that slide. So we also were puzzled by this. Let's see, are you able to see? Well, here, I'll put it back on screen sharing.
It's, we have it.
Oh, you had it. Okay, then I'll come back out. I have a better slide to answer your question, but I think over Zoom it's going to take too long to find it. So we also were puzzled by this, and indeed we were puzzled by the fact that what you were saying about stability is that you really need something that the square gradient term, and indeed in order to actually simulate this, you have to add that square gradient term. And why weren't these free energy terms appearing? And so we took a deep dive into the data to find the answer to that. And what we found is the bulk of the data that comes from these systems is in highly aligned regions. And so that's where most of what Cindy was doing was being performed on, was in highly aligned regions. If you focus just on regions that are in the vicinity of defects, you found that the contributions of the free energy terms and that square gradient term became much more significant. So we think that what we need to do actually is do a smarter sampling of the data where we focus more on the regions in the vicinity of defects, and then we actually will get contributions from the free energy terms and that square gradient term. What this is telling you is that you don't need those terms away from defects. And for these conditions, even in turbulent conditions, that's most of the data. But our evidence is that that's why the elastic terms weren't appearing.
Thank you. That's very clear.